A recent thread has been gathering some traction in one of the big antique sword collecting forums. And I thought it would be a good idea to talk about it because it actually addresses some topics that are, some points that are really important for sword collectors or antique collectors in general to think about and consider. And it then also addresses issues like conservation, restoration, and the ethics behind it, and what actions we consider correct and ethical, and which actions may not be that. The topic discussed on this thread is rather controversial, and it was actually brought to my attention by a friend and fellow sword collector. But in essence, it has to do with a restoration process that does not seem to have met the approval of the vast majority, if not the totality of the community. Now, this isn't to say that everyone necessarily disagrees. At the point of making this video, the replies have all been negative, but it's possible that someone shows up in support. I would not be surprised if that were to happen. So what I'm going to do here, because I already tried recording this video, but it turned out into an infinite ramble and rant that didn't really have a lot of structure to it. So I'm going to try and give a structure at the start and try and stick to it so that whatever I'm saying may be as useful or at least is followable. So we're going to first discuss the thread that inspired this video. We're going to kind of look into a few of the replies and a few of the counterpoints that were made by the person who opened this thread. And then we're going to use this information as a starting point to address a certain number of points that relate to ethical conservation and preservation of antiques, specifically swords. So let's start with the thread, and I'm not going to link to it because I don't want this discussion to be about the person and the choices they made and whether or not we agree with them, but I want it to be more about the topics and the discussions that their choices kind of enable us to have. So it should be more about the conversation than about the event, I think. I'm sure if you want to find it, you'll be able to find it, but I won't link it. In essence, someone shared a picture of a before-after kind of renovation they did on a sword, in which they brought it to new life or new authenticity. I don't remember exactly what the terms used were, but this was a Algerian Nimcha that, if I understand correctly, had already been shared earlier, and the general consensus was that it was a rather rare piece. Beat up, not in the best condition, that's for sure, and with a European blade, likely Polish. So this blade was removed from the Nimcha hilt and then mounted on a Karabela hilt, which was made really masterfully, if I may say so. It really looks good. It was made by the person who opened this thread on the forum. So they basically added this, removed this European blade and added it to a historically coherent or consistent hilt that they made. The general consensus in the replies was definitely negative. I would say, as I mentioned, I think all of the messages I read, all of the replies I read were very, very critical in different formats. And I have to say also in a very civil way, which is, I think, a testament. Again, I mention very often how I think this sword community is a really positive and great community. And I think the replies I saw were matched this kind of impression I have and the way I talk about the community. So there was no shaming necessarily or no really harsh replies, even though people were definitely not happy. But there was a lot of criticism for sure. And the two main points of criticism I want to mention are in 3 points, actually, perhaps, are in 2 comments. One of them, and I'm not quoting literally, but let's say the gist of it was that the person had a beat-up Algerian Nimcha and now has a replica. And the second comment addressed the fact that the person had been already told that this was a rare object, so this adds to the damage done, in their opinion, but also pointed out how this how this project will likely mislead collectors in the future. We'll address all of these points in more detail. I just want to kind of give an overview of what struck me in this conversation. I will say that OP did not necessarily agree with the criticism and actually replied with a few counterpoints to make a more clear point, I think, of what their reasoning was in starting off on this project. And these points kind of fall into, there are two main counterpoints, I would say. The first is, in essence, and again I'm not quoting, is that the most important part of a sword is the blade. And in essence, what determines authenticity of a sword is its blade. To support this opinion, they make the point that, for example, in Japanese culture, the blade is the most important part of the sword. And how, for example, the fact that in many Japanese swords, when you look at the tang, there are multiple holes, which have been added over time to kind of fit new and different fittings. So this obviously is a sign of how the fittings are not necessarily the crucial part of a Japanese sword. And I would add that another confirmation of this is perhaps in the fact that in the official, the highest level certification of antique Japanese swords, look at the blade. And so I'm by no means an expert, but let's say if you look at the certification documentation on many Japanese swords, the focus is usually on the hamon, on the tip, on the length, on the style of the tang, on the signature. Whereas we know that, let's say, many fittings in Japanese swords, you may have a Muromachi era blade, but it may be on a Edo fitting. That is nothing crazy in the landscape of Japanese swords. So this is a valid point that is being made. The second element that is brought, I think, to support the first counterpoint, the one of the blade being the most important part of the sword, is an example of many nimchas. It's mentioned that many nimchas have French blades, which have been taken and used on nimcha hilts. And the question is, does this make them less authentic? Of course, no, it doesn't, in the sense that it's a French blade. It was made for a certain model of sword. The fact that it's on the hilt of a nimcha does not detract from its authenticity. And I think the point that's being made here is that if it does not detract in that case, why would an authentic Polish antique blade being mounted on a Karabela hilt detract from the authenticity of this Polish blade? The second counterpoint being made, and again I'm paraphrasing, is that this Nimcha had a European blade. So by restoring it, you could say, to a historically coherent hilt, what has actually been done is restore authenticity to the sword. And in a sense, it's returning it to, I think the expression used is, its original source. So this is the overall state of the debate, in the sense that there are further replies, and some of them are really interesting and lengthy, and they go into personal experience and collecting as well. But overall, the points being made are these. The big criticism is that an object has lost historical authenticity and become a replica or a fake or something that is not anymore historical. And the counterpoint is, well, what we just mentioned, that the blade counts more, and that it being now looking coherent, historically coherent, is a good, positive aspect. So now we can move into discussing these points and what it can make us reflect on, and why we should reflect on it as a community. With all of this out of the way, the first thing I want to mention here is that there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea of wanting to bring new life or wanting to kind of restore an object, an antique object, to its original splendor. People like to maintain their objects. Wood gets oiled or varnished. Coins get cleaned. So there's all kinds of different interpretations, but I think there's nothing wrong with wanting something to look good and not just a piece of rust. I myself do this all the time. This is, I think, a phrase I use in most of my cleaning videos, wanting to give back dignity or beauty to an object that is dull and rusty. So I don't think there's anything wrong inherently in wanting to do this. But I do think that this should come after some serious questions. And these questions can go from really practical, which are, for example, what processes am I going to use to restore this object to its original beauty? And what are the risks involved in this process? Is there abrasion? Am I using chemicals? Is the medium I'm working on delicate? For example, there's a big difference working on steel versus a canvas with 500-year-old paint, for example. But then it also moves into more, I would say, almost philosophical topics, which are, I think, something like, what does it mean to restore an object to its original beauty, or its original purpose, or its original dignity of an object? And this is something that really depends on the object. It's not a one answer fits every object. Essentially, when we're talking about authenticity of an object and preserving or enhancing that authenticity or bringing it back to light, what we're often talking about is the distinction between personal opinion and, let's say, academically or professionally informed decision making. You may have guessed, but I definitely have a bias towards the latter of these approaches. So let's talk about a practical example related to authenticity. When it comes to this topic, I think everyone has different opinions. There are extremes, but I think the majority of opinions falls into kind of the middle of the spectrum, and it can be very difficult to kind of come to terms with what different people think. But looking at, let's say, some extreme cases, in the Rijksmuseum, the famous Night Watch by Rembrandt is being restored. The process is very delicate and done very professionally. Restoration in paintings often involves filling in areas where the paint may have degraded or chipped off. It's not the case of the Night Watch, I presume, because it's been kept well for hundreds of years. But in many cases, new paint is actually added to the canvas or the board. In some cases, if there's a rip in the canvas, for example, this rip gets restored and fixed. And all of these processes involve adding new material, for instance. So someone could say, okay, well, in that case, this is the proof that adding new material to an antique does not detract from its authenticity. Now, without going to the extremes of, let's say, full substitution of every brush stroke on a painting, but in the case of objects being restored many times, there is a deep professional and academic care and knowledge in the process that is being done. So the minimum amount of work is done to make it work. And it's done in ways that are coherent with the style of the past. So, for example, they may use pigments that are produced in a similar way to the way it was done in the past. They wouldn't use, I don't know, acrylic paint to restore a Rembrandt, for example. When dirt is removed, there is care to understanding how the original colors may have looked, for instance. And this all kind of contributes to a process of basically necessary maintenance. So we have to do it occasionally, regularly, because otherwise the object will decay. But what is being done with absolute care towards the integrity of the object. On the complete other end of this spectrum, we would have the famous, by now meme-worthy Ecce Homo, in a Spanish church, which I don't remember where it is now. I think now it's referred to commonly as Ecce Mono, which would mean, I think, behold the monkey. And it's that famous portrait of Jesus whose restoration was assigned to I assume and think, a very well-meaning painter who attempted to restore it, but basically destroyed it. So technically, what is the difference between these two layers, these two examples of restoration? They're both adding new elements or performing changes on a authentic background. So whether it's canvas, or in this case, I think it was a fresco in the church, in the case of the Spanish monster. But in one case, things are done with informed decision-making, consensus probably, and based on a kind of prioritizing the integrity of the object. And in the other case, it simply was an overpainting, a really bad one too, of art piece. I think legitimate restoration usually comes from a place of informed decision-making. If we talk about restoration and conservation, for example, we don't need to rely on our opinion and on our thoughts. There are infinite literature around the topic. There are even academic degrees, PhD programs, and a vast amount of different active communities of restorers who share techniques, approaches, and opinions. So something that kind of leans into this professional environment and support is generally what I would consider restoration project that comes from a place of true willingness to preserve the authenticity of an object, something that kind of springs up out of personal opinion and, hey, I think this looks good this way, is usually what I would be way more critical about. But what do you think? Now, the issue of authenticity also kind of introduces the topic of what the correct restoration approach is. For instance, we already discussed how there are big differences between the way traditional Japanese swords are preserved versus the way Western museums preserve, for example, medieval swords. We also see huge differences in the way archaeological remains, for example, are treated versus antiques. And this is just to say that there is a variety of different approaches, not each one of which can simply be taken and applied to every single object. The way we treat, for example, a piece of pottery from the 18th century is not the same as the way we would treat a Sumerian tablet found in the sand, for example. The way we treat wood from a shipwreck that's been underwater for 1,000 years is not the same way as we would treat a 19th century cupboard. For instance, if we're talking about swords, the choice of using an abrasive or not using an abrasive has consequences. The choice of which abrasive we use has consequences. Autosol is not the same as sandpaper, and sandpaper is not the same as a power tool, for instance. But the consequences of choosing a process don't only necessarily relate to the chemicals or the process of cleaning or preserving we use on an object. They even involve other choices we make that are more high level, I would say, or more abstract. So for instance, we may be using all the correct abrasives or products to clean a blade, but when we choose to change a hilt or to add a wire binding where it's come missing or to tighten the peen of a sword that is slightly loose in its hilt, we are making some very, very important choices. And these choices have consequences, and these consequences are often non-reversible, which is why these actions are often frowned upon within the sword collecting community. Now, there are degrees, of course. Adding wire binding to a grip where it was missing is absolutely reversible in most cases, and doesn't really cause a damage. It may cause questions about authenticity in the sense that, yeah, you're selling perhaps a sword that looks complete, but the wire binding is added a year ago. It's a different issue, though, when we're talking, for example, of repining a sword. And this is because repining it may add stress or tension to the whole assembly, for example, if done incorrectly. But also it is, even though it may be a very small intervention in the sense that it's just a few hammer blows on the end of the peen, but it is in essence not a reversible process. You are taking a product that is an object, that is a product of hundreds of years of time going by, and you're essentially deciding that you need to fix that passage of time and its toll on the object by tightening it, by tightening the peen, for example. I'm not going to judge here in the sense that I don't have a strong opinion on these matters, for instance. I think that in many cases, repining a sword may actually be an absolutely acceptable process to undertake. But it's fair, and we should ask ourselves these questions for every object we work on, because the answer will not always be the same, and what is acceptable on one sword may not be acceptable on others. Moreover, as collectors, I think we know very well that tampering with an object is generally not a positive thing. But there are also differences here, because the negative value we associate with tampering with an object depends on when and why that tampering with was done. So for instance, if a sword had a blade replaced in its time of use because the blade broke, because someone wanted a different blade on a specific hilt, that is not seen as a negative. That is absolutely part of its historical life. Things get a little different when we're looking, for example, at Victorian composites, of which there are many. Victorian composites are often looked at as borderline fakes. What saves them is that they are already now moving into a time of history. So when we look at a Victorian composite, we can kind of see it as an object that is the consequence of certain approaches to antiques in a certain time and a certain approach to collecting. So they are by now, again, historic objects. But generally speaking, if we know that a blade has been added to a hilt in Victorian times, or an antique blade has been added to a Victorian hilt, for example, that object has a different value, both historical and economical, by the way, to an original authentic object. The last layer of tampering is what someone may do in today's day and age, is basically what happened in the topic we're discussing. Generally speaking, the removal of a piece of the history of the object and the addition of something completely new is damaging to the historicity of the object. It may seem obvious, but it's not obvious to everyone, of course, given what we're talking about. And again, it's not also to say that this never has a place. There can be situations in which you do substitute a hilt, for example. Let's say a loose blade. It may not be ethically an issue to add a new hilt to it. Or, for example, a blade, an antique blade that was added in modern times to a different hilt. We could say that, okay, that change that was done perhaps in the early 20th century does not carry enough historical value to us to maintain it, and we may want to reverse it to an actual authentic hilt. But in the vast majority of cases, these are exceptions, of course, in the vast majority of cases, the general process and the consensus that I think 99% of collectors and professionals in the field of antique weapons would follow is the one of not touching or changing anything that carries historical value. Now, one possible reply that OP did not make in their counterpoints, but I can see someone making, is that, well, in the same way as Victorian changes now become part of history, this hilt that has been added today in 200 and 500 years will become a part of history as well. And this connects to the reply, the comment of this action potentially misleading someone in the future. Because the changes we make, especially big changes like making a new hilt for an antique blade, if they're not documented and they're not clearly marked as replicas, for instance, will eventually cause problems down the line. It will be in 100, 200 years, maybe it'll be out of our lifespan and we don't have to really think about it. But we risk adding, by doing this, we risk adding confusion and kind of muddying the waters for future collectors. This is actually a really big problem, I find, just as a extra point, with modern day replica makers. I honestly think there should be, if not legal, a moral obligation that modern replica makers should feel and do, of marking their objects in a way that is clearly identifying them as modern objects. The risk of these being either maliciously or not aged over time and then sold as originals is huge. And it's something that is going to come and haunt the collecting community in a perhaps not too far future. Now, speaking of tampering and changing the hilt in this case, it's also very interesting that it happened to a Nimcha, because Nimchas are well known for actually having all kinds of different blades, because over time these blades were either traded to North African pirates or merchants or military units, or they were looted during combat or found in any sort of other way. I would say that this is almost what I would consider a universal feature of the Nimcha, in the sense that it's very hard to describe or talk about Nimchas without describing also the provenance of the blades and this kind of very rich and varied network of trading and combat throughout the Mediterranean. This is actually a founding element of the Nimcha as a type of sword. So for me personally, this really adds to the bad decision making in this case, because the decision to consider the use of a European blade on the Nimcha hilt a kind of historical addition or something that did not match the authenticity of the blade does not absolutely fit my understanding, but I would argue the understanding of most people of what the Nimcha as a type of sword actually is. Also, speaking about wanting to remove an element that is considered spurious, perhaps, and substituting it with something that is correctly or historically correct or accurate. This reminds me almost a bit of an attempt to approach things in a philological way. So this is almost more wanting to rebuild something, like removing the incorrect layers and then bringing the object back to its original state. And while this is an approach that I would still not endorse, but I can see someone considering in the case of standardized mass-produced models. So of course, if you take the Italian 1855 that's hanging behind me, if I find an Italian 1855 blade on a random hilt, I may think, well, okay, I know exactly what an 1855 hilt is, and I can probably source it somewhere, and I can substitute it and recreate an 1855. I would still consider that to be a composite sword. I would not endorse that approach, but it kind of works in a philological sense of authentic recreation. But in this case, we don't know what the original hilt of that sword was. So this is not a restoration, this is not bringing a sword back to an authentic state. This is an artistic interpretation. And while, again, there's nothing illegal in doing it, perhaps, it's very important to understand that by doing an artistic interpretation project, we are not, we are throwing historicity, in a sense, out of the window and creating a new object that may be beautiful, it may be okay, but it's not a historical restoration or maintenance or conservation project. Someone could argue that this happens with painting all the time. It's not infrequent that through modern technology we're able to actually see what's underneath layers of paint, and then we figure out that a certain element of a painting has been overpainted by later additions. Another example is, for instance, in a recent case, Vermeer painting, if I'm not mistaken, what looked like an empty wall behind the scene actually proved to have, I think, a map or a painting. I'm not exactly, I don't remember the details, but basically something was underneath. And of course, through analysis of pigment, style, composition, brush strokes, and these kinds of details, experts and professionals can determine what is a later addition that does not have to do with the original painting. And then a decision can be made whether to remove that layer or to maintain it. So in the case of the Vermeer, for example, you may choose to remove it because you actually want to show what Vermeer had actually decided to show. And you know that that later addition wasn't done by him, it was done by someone else. So that is a choice that is definitely possible, but it does not fit really the sword example, because in the case specifically of this Nimcha/Karabela, but in the case of many other swords, we do not know what the original looked like. We can't use technology to look into the past and see what the original hilt was. We can only kind of interpret it. And between having a historically authentic piece, and by historically authentic I mean something that has come to us through hundreds of years, and having a modern artistic interpretation, I personally will always choose the first of these options. But it's a good question to have. And again, I ask you, what do you think? What would be your opinion on this, and what would you choose? The point OP makes is actually, look, things are done differently in Japan, for example, so it's not like I'm doing something incorrect. But there are 2 points I would like to make regarding this. The first is that you can't simply copy-paste methods for historical and cultural preservation from one place to the other and think they're going to work. What works in Japan isn't necessarily what works in Europe or in North Africa or in any other place in the world. And the second point is that this Japanese approach to their antique blades is perhaps not as different as we think it is on the surface. The reason why, and this is my personal opinion, but perhaps one of the reasons why Japanese blades, even 700, 800-year-old blades, are still perfectly polished and in serviceable condition, has less to do with a, I think, absolutely different cultural vision of things, but may have to do with the fact that Japanese swords did not evolve as dramatically as European swords did in terms of shape, size, and functionality, so that a sword from half a millennium ago could still be used 500 years later, whereas a Frankish sword would have no place in the time of the rapier, for example. And also maybe due to the fact that The sword in Japanese culture was a status symbol that was in use for way longer than it was in Europe. This means that a heirloom sword that may have been passed on for generations and generations and generations may still have had a active purpose as a status symbol in 19th century Japan, therefore being polished and maintained, whereas a rapier in the time of the small sword or in the time of the Napoleonic saber would have no reason to be polished and kept unless someone really liked it. So I'm fairly sure that if today a Japanese sword is excavated in some archaeological site, it will not be polished because that is the Japanese like approach to the sacrality of the blade. It will still be treated as an archaeological remain according to the standardized professional methodology. So my opinion is that even these cultural differences that are being highlighted and that we often think as being very different and opposite are not that different. They depend on specific aspects of cultural context. However, going back to the replies to this post, if you remember, one of them was about the danger of misleading future collectors. And I already addressed it in the sense that we talked about even the danger of replicas not being clearly marked as replicas. But we have even historical examples of how damaging this kind of nonchalant approach to composites and, mixing, matching pieces is. And the example is, ironically, with another African sword, the cascara. So in the 19th century, a lot of cascaras started being brought back to Europe by collectors. And a lot of these swords, obviously, we know have antique European blades, like broadsword blades in many cases, with markings and everything. So these cascaras were seen as a great source of antique European blades. And collectors at the time and dealers, maybe in good faith, maybe maliciously, but in many cases stripped these cascaras of their blades and mounted them on European hilts. And the reasoning was exactly the same as the one OP has in this post, was to bring these blades back to their original state. So the view of them being mounted on a cascara hilt was seen as kind of a deviation, perhaps, from their original and intended state. And at least for the ones in good faith, people may have been seeing this process of pairing them with a hilt, with a European hilt, as, restoring them to their ancient glory. However, one of the big problems here is that a lot of the cascara blades were locally made reproductions. So the blades were styled as European blades, and they even had the markings and the same kind of fuller patterns and everything as European blades. So what happened is that these dealers and collectors flooded the market with a whole bunch of essentially fakes. Cascara blades that may have been made in the 19th century and are being sold, or they're fooling buyers and perhaps museum staff and curators and stuff into thinking that what they are looking at and studying and analyzing and maybe reporting in books and studies. So you see how this one action has consequences that pollute not only the authenticity of a person's collection, but they pollute the research environment, they pollute publication. This means that new generations of people learn off of potentially incorrect source material, and the damage goes on and on and on. So, as collectors, what we need to do is think long-term and not just in the course of our lifespan and what benefits us and what we like and what we feel is good hanging on our wall. We need to think in terms of how will we give these objects back to the community when the time comes, and will we be able to provide extra information, or will we have stripped information that was there from them? And since I haven't shown any sword today, and I don't think necessarily you're tuning in to watch my face for half an hour, I'll quickly show you this. Because it actually fits this topic really comfortably, I think. So this is a sword I bought some time ago, and I bought it knowing it was a composite. So the blade doesn't necessarily match the hilt. And actually, if you have any experience with Swiss hilts, you may have recognized this dog head pommel, which is typically Swiss. but you'll see that it's kind of a bit of a messy hilt. The grip doesn't seem to really match the pommel. The pommel doesn't really match the style of the knuckle guard. If you look carefully, and we'll see that in another video, but you have to trust me on this one for now, the alloys even look different. So this is way more brassy, yellowy. This has a different color to it. So this is clearly a weird composite. And it's mounted on this blade, which I was very interested in because it looked fairly old to me. Turns out, after I shared it around a little, someone who actually does museum replicas for a living, so is quite experienced and is from the area, mentioned that, in their opinion, this is a 16th century Belluno-made storta blade. So it's the contrast between the hilt and the scabbard and the blade is even more jarring than I actually thought initially. What this person suggested to me was that since the hilt is just this weird mishmash of different styles and pieces, he was suggesting making a custom-made storta blade that would be consistent with the time of production of the blade. Now, the first thing he mentioned was that if this was the path I was interested in going down, the hilt would be marked with a date and would be clearly modern made, so that it would basically avoid what we were just talking about now. So in the future causing misunderstandings or worse, misleading a buyer. And this obviously is a testament to this person's professionality, but also I think is a good example of how we should be thinking even when we decide to make unconventional choices around what we're going to do with an antique. And I have to say, I did consider it at the time as an option, even though from what I've said so far in the video, you may think the opposite. But my reasoning here was that this is such a weird composite that doesn't fit necessarily a style of a time, that it may be a modern mix of pieces. I had the feeling that this could be simply an old blade that someone had a random knuckle guard hanging around, doghead pommel, and this relatively modern looking grip, and simply just put everything together into a sword. And if that was the case, I would be definitely open to adding a custom-made hilt, and I would consider this a not a bad choice to make. However, what makes me lean towards not doing it is the fact that this scabbard is obviously custom made for the blade, and it is obviously not a 16th century scabbard. So at some point in time, and this looks to me like late 18th century, perhaps 18th century, so at some point, hundreds of years potentially after the blade was forged, someone decided that they still wanted to use this sword, this blade, and made a scabbard for it. And I cannot determine for myself if these changes in the hilt were perhaps done at the time of the scabbard being made. So without knowing when the scabbard, when the hilt comes from, and if it dates to the same time as the scabbard, so it's actually an antique, I do not feel comfortable removing it, because what I have here potentially is, yes, a composite, but it's something that went through hundreds of years and was taken and reused and adapted to modern use, and now is in my hands. And I will not change it or remove anything from it if I don't have the guarantee that this change was done in modern times and has nothing to do with its lived history. Another cool example, and I'll show you a picture somewhere here on the screen because I think they're really interesting objects, but are these helmets you find, I think they're in the British Museum if I'm not mistaken, at least one of them. And these helmets were used as pots. So these were military helmets that at some point were not needed anymore and were converted into pots. So you'll see them, they have they've been adapted to be able to hang over fire. And the big question here is, yes, these were changes. Yes, it was born as a helmet, that object, and making it into a pot, way more than a Karabela turned into a Nimcha, kind of defeats its original purpose and its original glory use. But should we turn them back into helmets, or is the fact that they became pots at some point hundreds of years ago an integral part of their history? This is the big question. I think obviously my answer, I think is obvious, and it's that these objects are part of history and should not be changed. Obviously, this is the opinion of the British Museum too in this case, but someone seems to disagree. Still, it's a good question that we should ask ourselves. Anyway, so far we've looked at the issue, so we've looked at this restoration, we can kind of call it project, and we've seen the main points of concern and what kind of deeper issues these raise. I also think I've been rather open-minded in trying to at least relate to the choices that led to this project. And even though I absolutely disagree with what was done, I do think I kind of understand where this approach comes from. However, there are also some elements that I think are objectively wrong, and these don't fall on that spectrum of opinion between extremes that we mentioned. This isn't an issue of I think a certain thing or I think another and we kind of disagree. These, in my opinion, are actual mistakes that informed the decision-making that led to this process, and I want to discuss them just because I think it's important to understand that things go beyond just opinion. The first is the importance that OP gives to the blade. So it's mentioned that the blade is what defines the authenticity of a sword or something like that, and this is simply not true. It's not true for a few reasons, actually. The first is that an antique sword, as any antique, needs to be looked at in a holistic way. You cannot reduce your point of view to a single aspect of object and decide that that has priority over everything else. You can do it if you're doing some sort of academic analysis, for example. So if your study is on sword blades, of course you're going to be focusing on blades. If you're writing a book about pommels, yes, pommels become the center of your investigation. But when looking at returning an object to its authentic state, or restoring an object, or describing an object in its historical context, we cannot simply pick and choose and prioritize which elements we think come before others. And this isn't just because we have to treat everything in the same way. So if we take archaeology, for example, the importance isn't so much in the object that is excavated, unless, of course, it's some amazing treasure that is found, which happens. But in most cases, archaeologists are working like in trash heaps of the past. So they might be looking through layers of pottery shards and leftover meals. It's at what level of the excavation is this pot found, and is this consistent with what we expect to see? And if it's not, how can we explain it? And if we simply decide that what's important is the earthware because of some subjective value we attribute to it, or because we like having a pot in our museum or in our private collection, what we may do is pick up these shards or these pots and wash them up, because why would we want to have dusty or muddy remains? We want them nice and clean. We want to see the inscriptions maybe. And this is important, but by removing these layers and by taking the object out of its holistic context, we are destroying any information that object might have been able to convey. When we look at antiques, things are a little bit different because most of them aren't excavated. And also, you may add, well, a sword is just metal. So unlike a painting or unlike organic antique like wood or something, we can't really do we can't do carbon analysis on it. We can't look at the composition of the paint and the pigments to see if it's consistent with what was used in the 17th century versus the 19th. We can't look at the canvas and see if it matches what we expect, the frame. However, even on a sword, we can look, well, first of all, we could perform some metallurgical analysis, even though that may be way out of scope for the average sword collector. But even the inscriptions, the markings, scuff marks, the way the whole sword ages and is weathered over time, all of this can give us a lot of information, even though it may not be scientifically certified, but it can enable us to kind of place it within a certain context of time and of completeness. So the idea that we can just pick a certain element and decide that this is the most important part, and we define authenticity of this object through this one criterion, is absolutely incorrect. Now, another reason why I can safely, confidently say that the blade is not the core part of a sword or the defining aspect of the sword is that this is simply negated by a lot of military manuals, a lot of regulations. For example, if we look at French 19th century regulations, the defining aspect of the sword is the hilt. And this is true for many different regulations. That's not to say that all of them valued the hilt. There are many cases in which the blade has strict definitions as well. But it's just to say that this blanket statement that, oh, this action I performed is fine because the blade is the most important thing in the sword, is just simply not true. And to further add to this, we can take the example of Norman's rapier and smallsword typology that is defined in the book, The Rapier and the Smallsword. And in this, his whole typology, which is the reference point for the study of rapiers and smallswords, is the hilt. The hilt is what defines the different types of Norman typology rapiers. And that is, by the way, because of the impossibility or the huge difficulty in being able to determine accurately and correctly what is an authentic, original rapier versus a composite. Composites were so prominent in the past and in the present that most rapiers we see in museums or in private collections, we cannot really guarantee that that is the exact configuration that was initially designed for that hilt. Blades were broke, they were changed over time, certain shapes maybe passed in fashion, new ones came to be. And the only way, according to Norman, the only real solid way to determine that a full sword is actually accurate is if we also have the scabbard and if, let's say, the decorations on the hilt match the decorations of the scabbard, because obviously that means that scabbard and hilt are consistent. And if the blade fits perfectly in the scabbard, that means all three elements are consistent with being produced at the same time. But we have very few rapier scabbards, and also to have such decor that you would be able to find connections, we're talking about very high-end swords usually. So he had to resort to exclusively looking at hilts, because most of the things you find in museums and most of the things you find in private collections are probably composites. And if they're not, there's no way for us to say they're not. So we have to kind of err on the side of caution. So, I mean, we have various examples here of how the blade is just not the center piece of a sword, and it is definitely not the element that defines authenticity of a sword. Of course, this isn't true everywhere. We did mention how in Japan, the blade carries a central importance to the sword, and how fittings can change, but overall it's the blade that gets brought generation after generation and passed on and is the heirloom that has value. However, this is true in Japan. And this is another kind of methodologically problematic thing to do, which is to copy certain cultural habits or approaches to heritage and conservation and try and paste them onto something that does not fit. The way Japanese swords were considered and cared for and brought on in time does not fit the way European swords or the place European swords have in European culture. And it definitely does not fit the context in which European blades were used on North African hilts, like in the case of the Nimcha, or in the Sahel, like is the case with the Cascara, for example. This attempt to simply copy-paste a cultural practice kind of completely disregards, I think, all of the values that stand behind that cultural practice. So it's just taking the act of polishing or the act of changing the fittings without considering all of the deeper meanings that those actions carry with them and why they fit, for instance, in Japan, but don't fit in Europe. And of course, all of this is not to say that blades do not communicate authenticity. The example OP makes actually of Nimchas being mounted with French blades is actually exactly supporting this perspective. The blade itself is a French blade. It's an authentic blade, but it is not a model whatever French sword. It is a French blade, which now is part of a Nimcha. Whereas the idea that the proper place, whatever that means, for this French blade should be on a French hilt just because it was made in France, kind of completely overlooks the rich historical interactions between Europeans and North Africans, whether these were via commerce or because of conflict or because of all kinds of, I mean, the Mediterranean isn't huge, and it's basically a basin on which a bunch of different cultures stare each other in the eye to an extent, right? So to think that just because a French blade is on a North African hilt, that is in some way incorrect, is wanting to delete all of this rich kind of tapestry of context that instead should be able to inform us about different events in the life cycle of the object. So the presence of European blades on Nimchas, for instance, isn't just an aberration in the normal process of how that blade should have been used. Blades were looted during combat, but that is part of their history. The fact that a certain blade was picked up on a battlefield and then rehilted as a trophy or because it looked good or felt good to someone is part of its history. And also, not all blades were looted or stolen or taken. Like most of them probably were traded. The blades that were being made in Europe, there were countless amounts of them. They were being traded all over, not only in North Africa. We have European blades as far as Indonesia, further on as well. If you really love swords and antiques, why would you want to overlook these aspects of the object's history? I don't understand that. But it's really wrong from a historical practitioner, in a sense, or collector's perspective, because you're basically wearing blindfolds and deciding that certain elements of the history of the object you own don't count. And we, as people, as individuals, don't have the luxury to be able to make that decision. And another point that I want to mention, it's kind of connected to this, and I want to preface here that I don't think in any way that OP, who made this change on the hilt, did this with these kinds of malicious intentions. I just want to point these out because I think there's like a dangerous slope that people can take, or involuntarily, especially if we communicate things to others who reinterpret them in different ways. But stating that a certain object, even though it went through historically confirmed changes and events, like a blade on an Nimcha hilt, is not authentic or is not in its proper setting, is dangerously close to denying the authenticity of otherness, you could say. And it's dangerously close to stating that the only value, the only historical value an object has is the one you value, which is obviously usually connected to your cultural heritage or your interest. And this is very dangerous because it can lead to denying the value of other cultures, other people, other historical experiences, for example. Swords and people, merchandise, troops moved all over the world, interacted. There's all, and to kind of say that some of these interactions are the proper ones and other ones aren't, opens or risks opening some very unpleasant doors that probably shouldn't be open. So I made these last points to address what I actually consider real errors in OP's perspective. These I don't think are a matter of opinion, they're just wrong from my perspective. And again, I want to reiterate that I don't think OP or anyone in this thread is maliciously making choices to deny parts of history or these kinds of things. I just think that this perspective of the blade being central to everything kind of skews everything into a direction that then has these consequences. But anyway, after all of this rambling, where does this leave me in terms of my opinions on what happened here? Where does this leave us as the small community of this YouTube channel, but also as the broader community of sword collectors and antique collectors in general? Well, the first thing, I think this was a bad move. And while I do think that with the craftsmanship that this person displayed, they may have room for a, working on museum replicas, on building educational, on being able to use that talent for a positive purpose that is educational. I do think this was a bad move. I think removing what happened to that Nimcha hilt, for example. I would also suggest that in general, beyond staying informed and getting educated on conservation and preservation of antiques and maintenance, that there should be a general mindset of minimal action being taken. So why are we taking action, and what is the minimum amount of work we can do to obtain that result without further altering or damaging the antique? I think having this as a starting point is probably, at least for non-specialized work. Of course, I'm talking as a collector who cleans his swords, not as a world expert in sword restoration. Perhaps I think this may be a good opportunity for the sword community to start thinking in terms of an actual community. At the moment, there are a lot of fragmented groups. You have subreddits, discords, different forums, different private groups and websites. There might be some kind of association of antique sword collectors, at least on a national level there probably are. But I think it's probably important that we start discussing these like best practices, guidelines. We have some kind of maybe open document that people can contribute to, or something similar. I don't know, I haven't thought about it enough. But collectors already have, in many cases, a relatively bad reputation because of a lot of malpractice that happens in the collecting world. And I think by acknowledging that there are these malpractice issues and by trying to find solutions to them, even though they may be prescriptive more than enforceable, I think that could maybe put us as a community in a better position to share also the value of the good things we do. And of course, as a last point, I already mentioned this, but the response of the community to this post has been really positive and supportive, even though critical. And I think this is a defining element of the antique sword community. It's a very positive environment that is helpful and is able to provide criticism without falling into negative interactions or, just bickering. So I hope that if any conversation does develop out of this, it maintains this positive focus that I've always seen so far. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this gives you something to think about. If you have any thoughts about it, I'm literally calling for a conversation, so we can have it in the comments. You can respond with a video, you can do whatever you want, but it would be really nice to see this kind of happening. I'm very sorry for that Nimcha, and I really hope we don't see a lot more of these kinds of projects, but yeah, there's nothing we can do about that. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon in another sword video. Bye!